All right. So I'd like to precede today's seminar just with a few trigger warnings. So if at any point we mention a trigger or the following triggers may be overwhelming, please don't be afraid to step away from the call, either by hanging up, leaving the call, or just physically leaving your device momentarily, and come back if you feel ready. So trigger warnings for today's seminar include self-harm, substance abuse, PTSD, and generally traumatic events. So finally, just before we begin, please be respectful to the speakers by sharing your questions and comments if you have any during the presentation in the chat, and stay muted. And we'll respond to your questions and comments at the end of our presentations in our Q&A session. Yeah, so without further ado, here are Natalie and Ariel.
Hi everyone, I'm Ariel and I'm a junior at Cupertino High School.
Hi, I'm Natalie and I'm a freshman at Gunn High School. We are part of an organization called BayEcho, which is a safe environment for local high schoolers in the Silicon Valley to articulate complex thoughts on social issues relevant to teenagers and parents in our community. We present on shared findings and personal anecdotes to fuel lasting understanding and ultimately strengthen family bonds.
So through this presentation, we hope you'll all learn some ways to identify trauma through symptoms and experiences, learn how to or understand how trauma affects mental and physical health, and learn how to better cope with trauma and recognize poor coping mechanisms. So to start off, what is trauma? The general definition of trauma is that it is the result from exposure to an incident or series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening. Trauma has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and/or spiritual well-being. So trauma can come from a threat or a perceived threat to someone's physical well-being, or someone or something of importance, such as someone's parents or their siblings. There are three types of trauma: acute trauma, chronic trauma, and complex trauma. And while all of these types of traumas are different, they'll all lead to mental and physical health risks if left untreated or unrecognized. When people first think of trauma, acute trauma is usually what comes to mind. So acute trauma is the trauma that results from a single stressful or dangerous event, which can include like a car crash, natural disaster, crime, or witnessing a violent event. And people suffering from acute trauma are usually told to get over it, even though their symptoms usually present earlier or more quickly after the event. And some of these symptoms can include severe panic or extreme anxiety, confusion or irritation, disassociation or a feeling of disconnection from yourself and your surroundings, insomnia or being unable to sleep, suspiciousness or acting in strange ways, lack of self-care and poor grooming, or loss of focus and production at work and school. So chronic and complex trauma, which are the next two categories, are different from acute trauma because the symptoms tend to present later and the impacts are often more severe and persistent. So chronic trauma results from repeated and or prolonged exposure to highly stressful events. So this can be any form of abuse, such as emotional abuse, physical abuse, domestic abuse, child abuse, and sexual abuse. It can also include gaslighting or manipulation. Gaslighting describes the interaction of one person manipulating another person into making them doubt their own memories, feelings, or senses. So people who are victims of gaslighting may believe that they themselves are not mentally well or trustworthy, which makes them dependent on their abuser. So some common phrases that someone who gaslights may use are, you are wrong, you never remember things correctly, you're imagining things, stop overreacting, or you're too sensitive, I don't know what you're talking about, or I don't understand and you're just trying to confuse me. And another way that chronic trauma can occur is due to bullying. So Brain in the Palm of Your Hand is an exercise developed by Dr. Dan Siegel and Mary Hartzell from Mindsight Institute to better understand the brain of someone who suffers from chronic trauma. So if you want, you can look at my screen. I'll be demonstrating and you can follow along if you want to. So first, you're going to want to make a fist with your thumb tucked inside of your fingers. So now imagine that your hand is the brain and your wrist and arm is the spinal cord. So your palm of the brain, which is the primitive brain, or your palm of your hand, which is the primitive brain, controls the involuntary action such as blinking, breathing, and digestion. And the back of your hand and fingers are what is called the cerebral cortex, which manages the high functioning part of your brain, or the rational and logical thinking. And tucked inside of your brain is the middle brain, or the emotional center of your brain that manages your survival instincts such as fight or flight. So when people experience chronic trauma, the brain stops thinking logically and starts relying solely on the survival part of their brain. So instead of using logic and reasoning, children affected by chronic trauma will immediately default to their survival instinct, causing them to fight, flight, or freeze in the moment. And as other parts of their brain, such as the prefrontal cortex, continue to develop into their adulthood, chronic trauma prevents the child from learning how to use these newly developed parts of their brain. And this is why the actual age and the developmental age are hugely different in children who experience chronic trauma. And complex trauma is very similar to chronic trauma, in which that the complex trauma results from exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events. But with complex trauma, it usually begins from a young age and within the context of an interpersonal relationship. So complex trauma can come from civil unrest and war, sexual trafficking and exploitation, neglect, and also abuse. And those who experience chronic and complex trauma often experience feeling trapped, feelings of shame, and trust and self-esteem issues. They will also more often rely on negative coping strategies such as alcohol and drug use, self-harm, and over and under eating. And chronic and complex trauma will often affect the emotional and physical health, overall well-being, and relationships and daily functioning of its victims. And here's an infographic that's very helpful and goes more in depth about the different impacts of chronic and complex trauma. So feel free to take a picture of this slide, take a screenshot, or you can access this infographic by going to the website that's at the bottom of the slide. And I think Joy also just pasted it in the chat.
So with all these different types of trauma, there are also different effects that can result from the trauma, including physical, emotional, mental, and social effects. These are some of the emotional effects of trauma. So if someone ties a feeling that was felt with the trauma at the time of the trauma, they may choose not to express this feeling because of the association with the trauma. Some people also have emotional dysregulation, which is inability to regulate one's emotions. They can either feel too much or too little of an emotion, and this is more likely to happen at a younger age. There are also some different stress disorders, which I'll be going into next. So these are two stress disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder and acute stress disorder. While they're very similar disorders, there are also some differences. For instance, PTSD usually happens in the later stages, and ASD usually happens within the first month. Some of the symptoms of PTSD include hyperarousal, which can be sleeplessness, outburst, or difficulty concentrating. And there's also avoidance or intrusive symptoms. Intrusive symptoms are flashbacks or dreams that can elicit a strong reaction out of a person. Some symptoms of ASD include flashbacks, nightmares, derealization, which is feeling a detachment to reality, depersonalization, which is feeling a detachment from oneself, and there's also avoidance. So these are some of the physical effects of trauma, and some of these just affect different parts of the body, like the intestines or the heart. And some people also have somatic complaints, which are extreme anxiety and pain. And some people have dissociation, which is the inability to track an action. And an example of which would be walking somewhere but not remembering what you were doing while walking. Some people also resort to substance abuse, and others use self-harm, which is any deliberate act of self-injury or harm to themselves. So with the diagnosis of different conditions, there are also misdiagnoses, and sometimes the patient can become confused or distraught when the treatment isn't working, which may result in them blaming themselves. And like I stated before, sometimes the medication will not work because the person was diagnosed incorrectly, and this can cause the person's condition to worsen. And sometimes there are even some new conditions that arise. So this is an image of a Venn diagram between trauma and ADHD. And as you can see, there's a lot of overlap between the two, which makes it even more important for a correct diagnosis. Because without proper medication, a child with ADHD could experience failure in school, relationships, or even have depression. And a child with trauma without correct medication could have their brain structure affected or have their memory, attention, behavior, and social emotional life affected in harmful ways. Next, there are triggers and flashbacks. So triggers are any stimuli that bring out a memory of the trauma, and they can be from any of the five senses. Examples of this would often include seeing a person related to the trauma, or smelling a scent that was tied to the trauma, or any objects or places reminding someone of the trauma. There are also flashbacks, which is when someone relives a traumatic moment, and these are often caused by triggers. People deal with trauma in different ways, which I'll be going into next. So coping is a process where you try to tolerate and minimize different problems in your life causing you stress, and coping methods are often used as a attempt to combat trauma, and they're both healthy and unhealthy methods of coping. So as I mentioned before, they're both healthy, which is adaptive, and unhealthy, which is maladaptive coping methods. These are some of the positive coping methods, and there are emotion-based and problem-based coping methods. So emotion-based coping is helpful when you need to take care of your feelings, while the situation is not something you could control. And examples of these are meditation, exercise, and journaling. And problem-based coping is when you want to change a situation in your life, examples of which are time management or therapy. So, can you go back a slide, please? So it may be hard to start putting these coping methods into practice, but if you tell yourself to just do one little thing each day, you will gradually improve.
However, too much of any certain healthy coping mechanism can easily cause an obsession, and the positive coping mechanism will become unhealthy. So it's really important to find the perfect balance that works for you. So maladaptive or negative coping mechanisms are coping mechanisms that make you feel better in the short term, but end up being detrimental in the long term. So some of these coping mechanisms include avoidance or running away from your problems, overexertion or overcommitment, dietary changes, which includes over and under eating, emotional and violent outbursts onto others, substance abuse, excessive spending or retail therapy, self-blame, aggression like passive aggressiveness or anger, self-harm, and even daydreaming. So some negative coping strategies are more often recognized as a trauma response because they're easier to spot. So this is often because the effects may be immediate, such as in retail therapy, or because the effects are physical, such as a change in eating habits or substance abuse. But some negative coping mechanisms are harder to recognize or are often dismissed as a positive improvement to someone's life. So for example, nail biting and hair picking can be a form of self-harm and a trauma response, but many people only recognize it as a bad habit. And perfectionism or being overachieving is often seen as motivating or inspirational, but overworking yourself by constantly setting higher expectations or trying to achieve more and more can easily become a way to avoid confronting your own trauma. And as stated previously, a balance in coping is always important, even though they're positive. So, of course, exercising is a good thing, but once you become irritable, anxious, or depressed the moment you're not in a gym, it's likely that that healthy coping mechanism has become obsessive, which turns it into an unhealthy coping mechanism. So it's important to think critically about the ways that you cope in order to avoid these negative coping mechanisms. Hopefully, through today's presentation, you've learned about ways to identify trauma through symptoms and experiences, further understand how trauma affects mental and physical health, and also learn how to moderate positive coping mechanisms at healthy levels.
So if you notice that someone is going through a traumatic experience, you can try to be there for them empathetically. First, something you could do is encourage them to lead the conversation. For instance, you could ask, "Can we talk about this tonight?" versus "Let's talk." And the first statement is better because it allows the person to delay or refuse the conversation, whereas for the other statement, it may cause the person to feel like they are forced to talk and they may be uncomfortable. When you're talking with a person, you also want to validate their feelings. So instead of saying things like, "But you have this," or "There are people doing worse than you can not see them." And also, when you're talking with them, you want to avoid putting your own input into the conversation or giving advice unless they request it. So instead of saying things like, "Maybe you should try or do this," you could say something like, "It sounds like you're feeling this way."
Thank you everyone for attending our seminars. These past few weeks, these students have worked very, very hard on these. And if we could just give them a round of applause using our reaction buttons like this, that would be great. I'm Johnny. I'm one of the co-advisors here at BayEcho. We've been working on these presentations for the past few weeks, and we've also been reading a book called Say What You Mean. If you guys are interested in this, please let us know so you can follow along with us. But for now, we will be doing a bit of Q&A. So if you have any questions, please feel free to either unmute yourself or just go to the chat box and put your question there.
So a question that we addressed in the first seminar for healthy communication, and I kind of want to readdress it today because I think it's rather applicable. Someone asked for the first one, and also they might be here today, I don't know.
Oops, I accidentally paused the recording. When it comes to antidepressants specifically, it's a little bit hard to tell whether at times things are getting a little bit worse or if there are other times where it can make someone a bit more manic. It really just depends person to person. They can make you a little bit more sleepy. Some people take them at night instead of during the day. Let's see, there's also they can also make some of the depression symptoms a bit worse, and but that isn't the case for everyone. More often than not, people find their medication to be more useful, if anything. Another thing to be aware of is sudden mood drops. Depending on the medication, it can depending on the medication, if it is a stimulant, you'll eventually come to you'll kind of have a drop within your mood at some point. So that's just kind of something to keep an eye on, as well as sometimes these medications can also change someone's eating habits. They can feel not as hungry, things like that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So some applicable, like kind of more relevant, maybe Ariel or Natalie will be able to answer. Oh, sorry. So one question that we got in the registration form, it was why might teenagers able to, oh, why does the, that's weird. Why might teenagers not be able to or not be willing to speak to their parents about their traumatic events, and what can parents do to try to improve the situation? I think a little bit of that was answered during the presentation, but I'd kind of like to address it again.
Yeah, I think like Natalie said earlier, I think what makes it hard sometimes for children to bring up their trauma to their parents is how their parents approach them first. So I guess sometimes in conversation, if the parent is not being very like validating or isn't or is not being very empathetic to the child, that might make them like back away and not want to share anymore with their parents. Natalie, if you want to expand on that.
Right. I also agree with you in that it's mainly on how the parent acts toward their child and how they approach their child. And like I said before in the conclusion slide, you can to let them lead the conversation and not have your own input and just be empathetic with your child.
I completely agree with that. So the thing with empathy is to remember, excuse me, that it's not the same as sympathy, right? Sympathy is when you feel bad for someone, right? When you give someone your condolences or you have sympathy for um, an injured dog on the street. But empathy is more about validating and joining in someone's feelings. So I think it's extremely important as parents who are trying to connect to their children, who might really be slow about opening up with what they're going through. It's really important to be empathetic and not sympathetic to their experiences of trauma, um, and really just prompting things with, starting conversations maybe or opening up conversations with, I've been noticing that you seem to be down lately. Is there something I can do for you? Or is there like, um, would you like to talk about it? And making it open in that way to show that um, you're there to validate and help them experience and process emotions, um, as opposed to what happened, can I like help you, or I mean I'm like, offering advice of, oh, maybe you should go and do this, or um maybe you should get over it. But just, validating feelings, as Ariel and Natalie were saying, through empathy are very, very important. Yeah. um I saw another one. Oh, yeah. So, um, some examples of like validating feelings are like, especially if your child were to come up to you and say, I think I'm depressed, or I think I want to talk to a therapist, or I'm having a really hard time. Like, they might be telling you that they're having a hard time, or you might even just, um, they might not even open it up. You might be able to just pick up on their behavior. So some examples of like validating things to say like to say like, yeah, I can see that you feel that way. Or if someone is behaving a certain way and you're not super sure, to ask them, it seems like, you might be feeling depressed, or it seems like your anxiety might be really prominent in your life, right? And then asking them questions, but not necessarily giving advice, right? um some responses that are closed-minded, and I'll maybe um, let Ariel, Natalie, or Johnny give a couple as well. But some responses that are invalidating, right? That can close someone up from opening up, might be things like, "Oh, when I was your age, I was also depressed, but I still went to school every day and did well." Or, um, you know, when like saying things like, oh, but this person that I know, they lost, they're going through all of these things, but they are okay, they smile every day. That's an invalidating response because you're comparing them. I think that our communication group, which Brian was in, had talked about why comparing is not good, comparing any kind of individual. I don't know if the rest of this group has other examples of invalidating responses, or even validating good ways to respond. Like, if you were to go up to someone, what are some things that you would rather hear, and what are things that you um, would not want to hear?
I think for me, like I hear this sort of often, like from my friends or from the people around me, but they feel invalidated when their parents try to like assume where the problem is coming from. And I guess this sort of ties in with the advice giving thing. But just saying things like maybe it's because you're on your phone all the time, or maybe it's because you're not going out as often as you should be, or maybe it's because you're not sleeping enough, or doing this enough, or doing that enough, or not doing this enough. So I think like just trying not to assume uh, the person's situation or assume where the problem is coming from. I think that's a big thing about uh, like, yeah, like just being considerate of the other person.
Yeah, definitely. Like avoiding blaming the victim, right? If someone goes through something, avoiding saying, "Oh, well, it's because you did this." That can be really hurtful to hear oftentimes. Natalie or Johnny, do you have any thoughts for examples of good validating things to say or bad things to say, things to not say?
For me, I feel like I would rather not have someone try to comment on the situation by, like Ariel said earlier, just trying to determine where the cause was from. I would prefer if they're restating a feelings or like acknowledging that I'm feeling this way. So that would also really help.
I think that's something that that could be super helpful and like works. I can do this with my friends. Is if someone's having a bad day or like a hard time, and they start kind of spilling or like telling you about like what's going on, having that moment to just kind of say like, all right, so I'm here to fully support you, but how do you want me to support you? Do you want me to help you resolve this problem? Do you want me to just listen to process it? Do you want someone to be more responsive? It's really um, one of those case by case basis things that I think is really helpful. So just kind of like asking what someone's needs are during those times can be very, very helpful. And it can not only like help you, it can also help this person in a really good way.
Yeah, I definitely agree. You know, asking people what they need is a very big way to very quickly become empathetic, is just to say, if someone seems upset, you seem upset, what do you need? Like, do you need me to, like Johnny said, with what he and his friends do you need me to give you advice? Do you just want me to listen? Do you want me to, you know, respond and agree with what you're saying? Do you need the truth? Like what kinds of things? Or like do you want to figure out what's wrong, or do you want to just, you know, so figuring out what they need. That's a good one. I'm getting a few messages now. um so oh, there's quite a few. So for one, I'd like to, this is like, so someone said, especially right now, you know, teenagers and children want to go back to normal. And, you know, our current situation of the pandemic, which hopefully is, you know, lifting because vaccines are coming out. Um, although, you know, who knows how long that new normal will come, or that old normal will come back, and how much it'll come back. So I think it's really important to be empathetic and understanding that this is kind of like a small trauma that's happening. Like it was like, especially like for me, I remember last year how stressful it was. I was in my senior year of college, and I was expecting to experience so many things, and it was just like really jarring to realize that that wasn't going to happen. So understanding that for your high school students, or even if they're younger, that there are parts of their lives that they probably were picturing that were just taken away from them, and that can be really traumatic. So being understanding of that, I think is really important, and helping your students and your children process. So let me see if I can combine any of these questions. Um, right. So two questions that all kind of combine together of how can we help kids who, or how can we help, younger people or family members um, who are struggling with trauma or struggling with mental health, and when is the line drawn of whether they need professional help or not, right? So how can you help yourself, and when do you know, like how do you know if someone needs professional help?
Telling when someone needs professional help if they become a danger um, to themselves or others. And that can look like a lot of different ways. Yeah. Um, it's again one of those case by case basis things, but something to very much keep an eye out for would be if this person is quote unquote safe.
Yeah, I agree. I think self-harm, whether that's physically harming the outside body or even changing eating habits, that is a form of self-harm. Because either restricting your body from eating enough or eating well, that's kind of a way that people will deal with things, and that's especially important to get professional help. I think it's always safer to get professional help than not. Everybody can use a therapist, in my opinion, because everybody has their problems. So offering that is important. And I think, um, being open, especially if your children are wanting that professional help, to offer it and to allow that instead of to question the validity of whether they actually do need it or not. Um, yeah. So I have another question that might be, or I don't know if Ariel or Natalie had an answer. It's okay if not.
I have a question
Yeah.
in regards to Natalie's presentation. She mentioned about the trauma and a relation or overlapping with ADHD. There's one slide showing overlapping. My question is, will trauma cause ADHD?
So this is the slide that I think it was Maggie
Yeah.
talking about. I'll let either Natalie or Johnny or Ariel think about it. But so I think that's a really tricky question, because I think people's experiences in general can cause trauma. Someone with ADHD very well could as a result experience trauma because of the way they're treated at school. The way that I know a lot of people with especially learning disabilities or learning disorders, um, they feel invalidated constantly, especially by teachers who just don't know enough about it. Um, so yeah, I definitely think that it can become a trauma if, especially like trusted individuals like family members, close friends, and teachers are really invalidating towards a person's experience, especially a student's experience, because they, you know, especially as a child or a teenager and you're still dealing with what it means to have certain learning disabilities and how to deal with that, how to, how to deal with that in school and then eventually in the workplace. So yeah, I definitely think that that's possible. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, so with trauma and ADHD, so a lot of these things can look very similar. The way how trauma works is trauma will actually change the structure of the brain. So that can also have a hand in it. So it's kind of one of those things where you need to ask yourself what came first, the chicken or the egg. Because as well as with ADHD, we currently have a school system in place that isn't very affirming at times, and that can kind of feed into the trauma, which feeds into the ADHD, and it kind of perpetuates itself in a weird way. So there, from like some of my personal research right now, it's really one of those questions of that, like which one was there first, and does one cause the other, because they're very closely related.
Yeah, and if my understanding of ADHD is correct, I think that that's just something that is inherent in your brain structure or like, your genetics. So typically ADHD um is something that, isn't really caused. So I'm not a professional, so don't take my word on that. Um yeah.
ADHD can also be a symptom of other problems at hand, like dyslexia, or I believe it's also a symptom of bipolar disorder. So it's really one of those things where you don't know if it was there on its own or if it's part of something bigger.
Yeah, that's fair.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so someone asked, what if parents really want to know what caused depression, but kids refuse to tell?
That's a very hard one to tackle. So when it comes to a child opening up, things like that, you really need to consider power dynamic and how that works into relationships. Because if something has happened and the person doesn't feel comfortable sharing, especially when there's a power structure there, it's can lead to they're afraid that it'll lead to other problems. An example would be well, I'm trying to think. An example would be, say your child is being bullied at school, and they might be trying to handle it on their own. And maybe they're afraid that if they take it to someone higher up, things might get worse. So I guess when it comes to something like that, try to be as empathetic as possible. And also just be mindful of like, yeah, this my child might be a little concerned about what happens next. So I think that's really important.
I think especially if, maybe it's caused by a family member. I have friends who in college, so when they moved out from their parents' homes, really finally felt safe to open up about how their family members were abusive and caused really a lot of stress and, either depression or anxiety or PTSD because of their abusive nature. And it's just really hard, especially when it is someone in the family, to tell another person in the family, right? Because that can really um, change dynamics. I think especially since Asian households are so collective, meaning that we, share in our experiences more than see our experiences as solely our own. So because we as Asians typically have grown up in a household where, you know, we want to feel like we see each other as, you know, we experiencing things together. We experience things together. It can be really hard to open up about that as like as a child to your parent, or even if it is um, the parent themselves that might be, um, you know, a cause. It can be really hard to bring up, especially when they're living at home and don't have another safe place just in case things don't go well. That can be a really big cause to be cautious about sharing to their parents. I think it's more important to be sensitive if students are not willing to share, and it's definitely, you know, um, it's definitely dangerous to keep pushing if you're wanting to know but they don't want to share. Um, that can be, you know, borderline manipulative depending on how you're doing it. And you know, respecting their space of not wanting to share can actually show them that you are more willing to hear because, you know, um, they realize that you want what's best for them if you give that space. I don't know if that makes sense. um yeah, it is hard, but definitely, like, I think things become easier in terms of sharing once people are, or once, you know, young people are out of the home in different environments. And sometimes that helps with um being able to share more easily. I think I know so many people, like whether it was mental health or other reasons, who after going away for college or moving out for a job, um, after moving out, they were like, oh, I like finally was able to be so much closer to my family because we're in different places. So yeah, it takes a lot of things take time. Mhm.
Yeah, I think like Natalie said, letting the other person lead the conversation is really important. So maybe like backing off and giving them the space to do that will make them more comfortable with sharing um, their issues or sharing that with you.
Yeah, do we have any other questions? I'll look at one more time the registration form to see if we had any additional questions that were asked beforehand. Hmm. So I think something that we might have addressed a little less was, you know, trauma can often impact our self-esteem, right? So, and generally, you know, mental health, and also just honestly being a teenager, you know, self-esteem can be really difficult. So what are some ways that parents can help teenagers improve their self-esteem and even self-worth?
Um, like people said before, I would say to avoid comparing the child to other people. So, or maybe say if they get a good score on the test, you can congratulate them and say that they did a good job. So, in general, just acknowledging their hard work and to um, not bring up other people.
Yeah, like Natalie said, I think positive affirmations are really important. Just making sure you're reminding your child that like you're there to support them, and like congratulating them on their achievements and things like that.
Yeah, I like that. Oh, sorry.
No,
Both
no, you keep
answers,
going.
like, celebrating small wins. If your student is, um, getting a lot of C's and then all of a sudden they get a B minus, celebrating that is like, really big. Comparing people is so harmful, just because it defeats their worth as what they are and puts value into what they are in comparison next to someone else. And it can be really hard, especially if you're frustrated with how they're doing. Um, but yeah, so I think, like Ariel said, to just generally give compliments, say nice things. And if that's hard, taking it one step at a time by like maybe, sending a text once in a while or putting a post-it note in your children's bathroom that say something nice about them once in a while is a really easy way to start with if you're not ready to verbally say something. I know personally I'm really bad at verbal affirmations, so um, yeah. So yeah, Johnny, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say celebrate the small wins, because like that's super important. Every once in a while, like my mom does this every so often, like we'll just kind of be talking, and then like she'll just be like, no, like you've made it far, like this is something to be proud of. Like something like I don't know, like even graduating high school, as minorities, that's a very big achievement, especially. Um, and I guess like also looking a great way to do like looking at the small victories is to really just kind of back up and look at the full picture, and I guess like the grand scheme of things. Um, like you have this going on and this going on, but still you did what you had to in order to get here. So I would say kind of doing something like that would be really helpful, especially when it comes to just trying to like get your attitude up there.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, my teen is 18 now, and he has admitted to a good college, but I want to tell him that okay, I know so and so's kids have been admitted to some uh, universities, and they are trying to decide which one, and I haven't really started who that was and which college I'm going to talk about, but then my teen is saying that, oh, stop, I don't want to listen, anything you're going to say will upset me. So I just stop at that point, but I'm not trying to compare anything. I'm just trying to tell him that, oh, I know, okay, somebody's kid is going to have a decision about their choices. So I don't know why my kid is so agitated, like, oh, he sensed I'm going to tell him something somebody's going to do maybe better than him or something, but I don't have this intention. So how can I calm him down? So now I stop saying anything about other kids. Just okay. But I do want him to get informed that, like, okay, so and so's kid is doing this program, or so and so is going to make this choice because of what.
Mm. Yeah, I can kind of almost relate to that just because it's like I feel like I compare myself to other people and I don't really know where that comes from, whether that's because of, my family growing up, or because of whatever, but um regardless of what that original reason is, it's very possible that your child is comparing themselves already. So it can be really hard to realize that like it's in someone else as well. So it might just be, letting them have their space with that, which it's really good that you're trying to not bring up other students or other children's accomplishments, even though you're not trying to compare. They might just have that personal boundary of not being comfortable because, it might just be possible that your child is doing that self-comparison and having like hearing things, even if it's not to be compared, hearing things about other people like, oh, like look how well they're doing, or whatever, hearing those small things about other people, even though it's not to compare, not to say anyone's better than anybody, it can just be because of how they see themselves. So, going back to that last question of, improving their own self-esteem by encouraging them, complimenting them, reminding themselves of their own victories. Yeah. I don't know about your other answers here.
Yeah, great way to put it, Joy. But hmm. So I would suggest perhaps setting a time, and setting boundaries with him as well. Just kind of mentioning something such as like, okay, like, so that way we can't really say like, not now, let's schedule this. We're going to put this in the calendar. And until then, I won't bring this up. Or even just kind of like understanding a boundary of like, we're not going to talk about this on a holiday. Like on Christmas morning, you don't want to talk about your next steps in school. That's just personally me. So like taking those times and, well, yeah, mainly understanding the timing of it all. Um, and I would just kind of suggest perhaps doing family events, maybe with peers that or with some of his peers that are also doing awesome things, perhaps seeing if they can well, yeah, this is COVID, so that's going to be a bit hard. Try and see if your son can hang out with people his age, are doing very well, because iron sharpens iron. I thought that could be a very great way to maybe motivate him. Or perhaps hiring, if it's in the funds, hiring or talking to someone who will actually sit down with him and help him try to figure it out. Some high schools do something like that, like college and career counseling. That's been super helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, it can just be really stressful to hear about college admissions. I remember, like, I'm thinking back now to my like senior year of high school during that season, so I went to Limbrook, where, I think more than a third were like not accepted, but actually going to Berkeley. I think it was a really really high amount, and maybe it's not a third, but a lot of my peers went to UC Berkeley. A lot of them went to Ivy Leagues and top schools. And personally, I went to a school that had a 100% admission rate. Basically, they took everybody who wanted to come, and I think for myself to hear about everybody else who's doing well, even like last year, watching people graduate from top tier schools, while I graduated from, not a top tier school, that gave me a similar response. So, hearing about others can just be stressful. So it's really great that, I mean, he might not be doing it in a very healthy way, but it sounds like he's trying to draw a boundary of saying, I'm not really ready to hear that kind of news because I have a lot of pressure for myself. Um, so yeah. I had a question earlier and I kind of missed it a little bit. So one of the parents said, is or could, I guess, trauma be two-sided? For example, like if the parents cause trauma and the kid is in a deep trauma themselves, um, parents might be struggling to like forgive themselves, or to then deal with that, I guess. So could trauma potentially be two-sided, or would that be something else?
Is there a way that we could rephrase that?
I'm not sure. I think for me, okay, let me give what I think. And I think it's because like we're all humans and we all make mistakes. So it can be really hard when you do something you don't mean to, and you hurt someone, and then you might beat yourself about it, and like, um, that might become a thought or an event that is like something that you don't want to think about because it was so traumatizing for another person. Does that kind of clear things up a little? Yeah, it's like because like you say something you don't mean to say, you do something you don't mean to do, and then kind of dealing with that.
So
Because I
you
think
mean
that's
you
yeah.
mean like you're like almost like that person is going through the trauma, but you feel extreme guilt about it. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, like would that potentially, feed into trauma, or is that something else? Or
No, no, I definitely think in some way that it could be a trauma to the person who had committed or who had done the thing to someone. Um, I think that there is a layer of that. But I think what mainly like needs to happen is focusing in on what reconciliation is going to look like when it comes to a parent-child relationship, something like that. So going more with the restorative route would most likely be a lot more helpful. Um, and having like a hard conversation if you need to, like write things down, sign a piece of paper if you have to, um, or just make sure that you're getting to the bottom of what's going on. I think that when it comes to something like that specifically, what you do want to focus in on is mending the relationship and seeing the healing happen from that instead of just healing the trauma. I guess it's more of you would be treating more of the symptom than the root of the problem.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it can be healing for both parties, to go back and reconcile and apologize, but you need to remember, especially if you were the perpetrator, remember that that reconciliation of releasing that guilt, it's really small for you compared to that apology, and typically that apology means less to that other person than it does to you, right? You might apologize for having said something, and that person might say, oh, it's okay, like I forgive you, I'm dealing with it. um it it's much bigger for them to deal with. So I think being open about, letting them, like opening up to say like, okay, I know I hurt you, like what can I do um to, regain your trust? What can I do to make this better for us, and you know help the two of our relationship and our separate individual selves grow and heal from this. Um, so I think I'm not sure because again, we're not professionals. I'm not sure if that would classify quite as a trauma, but I do think that that kind of guilt it could eat at you, and become a really sensitive thing. And I don't know, is trauma self-inflicted? Could it be? You're, yeah. So I think that's a tricky question.
So I would say, sorry, wait, so trauma, one more time, what you were saying.
Could it be self-inflicted? Like, could you cause your own traumas?
A bit. There are times when the brain can make its own memories, things like that. You don't remember things just as clearly. But I mean, in a way, yes, trauma can be self-inflicted. Such, I suppose something would be like you're trespassing and you get arrested. Yeah, and then now anytime you see red and blue lights, like if it was on an open sign, you automatically think like it's the police. So it's something like that, I guess. Like it does cause trauma, it does cause a stress. So I guess you'd say like it can be kind of self brought on in a way. Yeah, especially when it comes to anxiety. Anxiety kind of makes you, well, anxiety and depression kind of makes you hurt your own feelings, and you keep picking, and it doesn't necessarily emotionally scab up in a way. So you kind of just end up hurting your own feelings and then digging in further. So yeah, in a way, your trauma can be self-induced in a way.
Yeah, like from your own actions. Or
Mhm.
even just the way that you keep on replaying things, the way that your brain reforms your truth. Yeah.
Mhm.
Any last questions before you wrap up? Yeah.
Yeah, can I ask a question? Um, so if if a student is struggling at school for either for learning disorder or without learning disorder, how can parents? So the parents are eager to help, but if the kids they refuse either tutor or refuse any form of help. What should parents do? Just back off and leave the students alone? But it's pretty troublesome to see them struggling. How, what is a proper way of communication or proper way of relating to the what is proper way to such that the the kids are more willing to accept help?
Yeah, so I personally did struggle with that. So I'm dyslexic and like have ADHD or ADD. And that was definitely a problem growing up. For me was that eventually I kind of came to a point where I would go to like therapy, I would go to some tutors, things like that. And I guess my mother, like I told my mother that I didn't want to go anymore. And I guess that my mom came um, to the point where it was like you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So there's that. I eventually ended up dropping all of the stuff. You don't necessarily have to. I don't know if that was necessarily a good choice. I don't know how things would have ended up, but this does happen. So I can assure you that this is nothing unusual or odd. What I would recommend is perhaps talking to the school, seeing if you can schedule him in with, like I said, a college and career counselor, or even talking to a regular counselor could also be very helpful, as well as perhaps seeing if you can talk to someone, especially if it's with a learning disability, diagnosed or undiagnosed. You can always talk to someone in the special ed department at your school, because learning disabilities do fall under special education. Also, you might want to look up something called a 504 plan. 504 plans are amazing. They are a saving grace. What it does essentially is you have a meeting with some people. For me, it was the principal, and we went over a little contract, pretty much saying what I can do, whether this be extra time on tests, a separate room for test taking, extra time on assignments. Literally, like he told us about like how one student even wrote hand signals into his contract, meaning that if he raised his hand with his left hand, not to call on him because he actually didn't know the answer. He just wanted to not look not smart in front of the class. So those are going to be very, very helpful tools. So like I said, ask if you can look up a 504 plan.
Okay, thank you very much for the information.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the response.
Yeah.
No, I don't know if Ariel or Natalie. I think part of it, like for me, I didn't really do well, and I think I had I had tutors. I know you just said that your student is refusing tutors. Um, you know, and if they're refusing it, they're refusing it. Sometimes you might just be like, hey, do you want to like try just one, see if you like them. If you don't like them, then you know, because there are tutors who are not very good, and I had fortunately really good tutors when I was in high school for subjects that I was struggling in. Um, there was only one class that I like, no matter how much I was tutored, and it was a good teacher, I just could not understand, and that was physics. But um, yeah, I think being able to take control of their own like education, you know, like for me I did better in college, and this isn't for like, you know, everybody. For me, I did better in college because I was able to actually take charge of my own classes, my own schedule, my own extracurriculars, and I was taking almost all of my classes were classes that I like to take, and that always helps. But I mean, you know, you can't really control that in high school. um but even to maybe ask like questions of like, not in a like, you have to ask it in a certain way. Like you can ask, oh, like how come you're like, it seems like you're not doing really well in school. Like, is there something that's going on, or whatever, like, but not asking in a way that's, how come you're not doing well in school? Why are you not doing, you know, but just in a genuinely curious manner of asking, or even asking like, could I ask you like why you are not open to help, or like um why do you seem upset when I suggest to like have a tutor, or you know, asking those kinds of questions, but in, again, in a way that is comes from genuine curiosity and concern, rather than um trying to get an answer really fast, you know, trying to come up with a solution. So like in the book that we're reading, Say What You Mean, there's an entire section that is, yeah, Johnny just held it up. There's an entire section that is about coming from curiosity and care, right? Where are your intentions? So, you know, when suggesting these, to genuinely come with an intention of wanting to help and wanting to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, like Joy said, I think it's important to make sure that it's coming across as like, I'm worried about you, like not, I'm not doing this because I want to raise your grades or get you into college, but because I'm concerned about how you're doing and your well-being. Yeah, I think that's important.
Yeah. And if we're real, like good grades are such like, you know, like they seem like such a big deal with colleges and careers, but like it's really not life or death, you know. If you know, if you fail out of high school, you can still go to community college later on when you're ready, get a degree, go to a good top college still, usually state college, but that's a whole other conversation. But you can still do very well and have a very good job if you know you struggle in high school a little bit. So remembering when you have these conversations that your child's well-being is so much more important than their grades. There are also people who do so well in high school, and then they go to college and they experience burnout and have to drop out from top tier colleges. um Stories like that happen all the time. So remember to value your child's well-being more than their grades.
Okay, yeah, that's very good suggestion. Thank you.
Um,
Yeah.
Also, if you have a chance to, especially when it comes to like people with different abilities when it comes to learning, I would suggest looking into colleges that have very good programs, or what's the word? Ah, help, academic help. Sorry.
Oh yeah, never mind. Like it's like IEPs, individualized
Yeah, like try to look for schools that cater more towards academic
accommodation.
support. because that will be very helpful in college. Especially smaller colleges tend to do a really good job, especially if your child tends to thrive more in discussion-based classes. Smaller colleges are great for that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Any other last questions? All right. So I think if that's it then, thank you all so much for coming and joining in our conversation for these great questions that we've had. We'll probably have another seminar or event in the summer, whether that's like, you know, June or July. We'll see and release that information when we get there. But yeah, so thank you so much for joining and supporting us and listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Yay. Okay. I think, I don't know when Sonia left, but
Hold on, should I kick out the other people?
uh sure. I think it's just Brian though who stayed.
No, my mom's still on the call.
No, like in terms of people who are in Bay.
Oh, so we're still meeting, right?
We'll just meet for like a minute.
Okay.
Is that your college decision?
I
No,
was gonna
sorry. I was okay. So I was meeting with a friend. And I wanted to hype them up because they're going there. So
Okay,
I
I was gonna
forgot to
say you
change
got to
it.
Stanford. That's no way the college you're going to.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, your shirt. It
Oh,
says
yeah. I need to check my video. Yeah,
That's
yeah.
Wait, recording. That's
oh yeah, we are.
yeah.